asked me to give a lecture on John Wycliffe. I prefer the pronunciation Wycliffe. I know a lot of people like Wycliffe. Both are fine, I'm sure. And I thought it would be best to give a survey of the Dark Ages, because in order to understand the significance of the Reformation, people like John Wycliffe, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, and others, it's important to understand why they were raised up by God because of the dark satanic rule over the centuries in Western Europe. So I don't want to take pot shots at anybody here. I want to give historical facts to put this in its proper perspective. So I hope you can forgive me, but these are historical facts, and I'm not, again, trying to slander or just be negative. But this is negative in many ways, and in the same way, it's extremely positive because God was working out his eternal redemptive purpose, even during the darkest of ages. So we will entitle this lecture, John Wycliffe, Part 1, The Dark Ages. I will say that we will not be speaking about John Wycliffe very much this evening because, like I said, I want to build up to the man himself. First, I'd like to deal with some fundamental presuppositions concerning history itself. And we need to understand that God is faithful to his covenant of grace, which is revealed in the person and work of the Lord Jesus Christ. Even in the darkest of times, God is sovereign and God is working out his eternal redemptive purpose. It may not seem like that when you're in those times, but God is always faithful to his covenant purpose of saving sinners. And not only that, God works out his eternal work, his eternal redemptive purpose through insignificant people, through people that don't mean very much to the world. He works through the weakest of people. He works through humble people. He works through meek people. He works through the uneducated. He works through very small churches. And he works through preachers who are unknown to the world. He works through faithful men of God that most of the world will never hear of. That's how God's kingdom goes on and on and on through every generation. No one ever hears about most Christians, most churches, and most pastors. But that is how God has always worked out his work. But every once in a great while, God raises up extraordinary men because of extraordinary times. And this was certainly true of men like the Apostle John, the Apostle Paul, John Owen, George Whitefield, George Washington, Charles Spurgeon, and of course the man that we want to speak about a little bit tonight anyway, John Wycliffe. Also, what's important to understand is the simplicity and power of New Testament Christianity. The common, nameless, faceless Christians during the Dark Ages were counted as sheep for the slaughter. They were faithful to God. They were faithful to Jesus Christ. They were faithful to the truth no matter what the cost. And they died for the Lord Jesus Christ. Countless millions of people lost their lives during the Dark Ages because they were faithful witnesses to Jesus Christ. Countless millions were martyred for the name of the Lord Jesus Christ simply because they would not bow the knee to anyone but Jesus Christ himself. Christians went through unspeakable persecution in order that they would declare to the world what is written in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. And that says, "Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." Before we move on, I want to ask a question. I want us to think about this for a moment. And that is there a difference between a common man and a great man? And in one way, there's no difference at all. And of course, on the other hand, there's great difference between a common man and a great man. But for this study, we need to ask that question, because we're going to be dealing with common, nameless, faceless people for the most part this evening. it's important to understand that great men never start out great and they never desire to be great. If a man lives his life desiring to be somebody, desiring to be great, you never want to follow a man like that. Great men are thrust into that position. The accomplishments and courage in time of persecution and death is not necessarily greater than a common man. All men, whether they are great or not so great, still have to endure the same type of trials. The significance between the common man during the Dark Ages and John Wycliffe was simply this. John Wycliffe was put in a strategic position by God that nobody else had. That's what made John Wycliffe a great man. John Wycliffe had the power of the pen, he had the power of the pulpit, and he had the power of Parliament. England used John Wycliffe for their political ends to free themselves from the bondage of Rome. And at the same time, God worked out his eternal redemptive purpose through the greatness of John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was an extraordinary man in extraordinary times, and he was thrust into that position because of the times, because of his position in life, and because God raised him up for that position itself. In John Wycliffe's mind, there was no difference between himself and a 13-year-old girl that was dragged out of her home in the middle of the night, dragged to a small creek by her house, and drowned unmercifully. What made Wycliffe great was that God raised him up and put him in a position of influence politically, spiritually, and historically. That little girl, that nameless little girl who died for Christ, was not placed in that position. John Wycliffe and that little girl, though, were both faithful to their calling, except John Wycliffe had a different position. The greatness of John Wycliffe and all the saints that preceded him under persecution was found in their character. That little girl and John Wycliffe had the same type of Christian character. They were humble servants of Jesus Christ who understood they were nothing more than humble sinners saved by grace. That was it. That's the difference. They were both sinners saved by grace. They were both faithful to their calling. But John Wycliffe rose to a great position in the world, and God used him in a great and mighty way. So yes, there is a difference. And on the other hand, there is no difference at all. Our next heading, if you will, is Jesus Christ and his church, the greatest threat to pagan nations and kings. The world will always and has always hated Jesus Christ because he is sovereign over all of his creation and over all nations. The world inherently hates the sovereign lordship of Jesus Christ because he is a threat to nations and kings. During the Roman Empire, during the pagan rise of the Roman Empire, people were required to go to a pagan altar, take a pinch of incense, throw it on the altar, and say, Caesar Kurios, Caesar is Lord. And that showed that they were good servants, good servants of the kingdom. Christians refused to do so. They said, Christos Kurios, Jesus is Lord, Christ is Lord. And for that, they were persecuted and put to death because they would not bow the knee to Caesar and make him a god. I want to go through just a quick overview of the pagan part of Rome. Nero, of course, was an extremely insane emperor, and he was extremely cruel to the Christian. The common charge to the Christians during the rule of Nero was their hatred of the human race. We hear that even today. The Christians are like that even in our day. Nothing has changed in 2,000 years. His favorite cruelties were to strip a Christian down, take dead animal skins and put them on them, and then place them into an area where wild dogs would eat them alive. He loved to put pitch on Christians and light them on fire and use them as lanterns for his garden parties, and he was also a lover of crucifying Christians. This is what Nero loved to do. This is what made him happy. Concerning the Roman persecution, Tertullian stated in about 150 AD, "All of your ingenious cruelties can accomplish nothing. They are only a lure to this sect. Our numbers increase the more you destroy us. The blood of the Christians is their seed." He also stated this, "We are a people of yesterday, and yet we have filled every place belonging to you, cities, islands, castles, towns, assemblies, your very camp, your tribes, companies, palace, senate, forum. We leave you your temples only. You can count your armies. Our number in a single province will be greater." This was the boldness of Christians in 150 AD. By 180 AD, the gospel had reached all parts of the Roman Empire, from England all the way to the Persian Gulf. Justin Martyr wrote, "There was no race, Greek or barbarian, that either wandered or dwelt in tents, which did not offer praise to the crucified." From 303 to 310 was the worst of the persecutions during the Roman Empire. Diocletian and Galerius attempted to systematically obliterate Christianity from the face of the earth. Christians were publicly whipped. They were dragged through the streets by their heels. They were put on the rack. Their teeth were beaten out. Their noses, hands, and ears were cut off. They had melted lead thrown on their naked bodies. Their eyes were dug out. They were burned alive. They were thrown off of tall buildings. They were starved to death. They were eaten by lions. They were crucified. They were scalped. Their homes were destroyed. Their places of worship were demolished. And their writings were burned. All this was done in the hope of erasing Christianity from earth. As early as 314 AD, pastors, bishops, already called bishops in England, from York, London, and Lincoln, attended a church council in France. They came back to England with a demonic rule to rule over men's soul. There was a preacher that was preaching the gospel there, and men were being won to Christ by this man in England. Mr. Alban was converted under this man's ministry. Mr. Alban took this preacher in and took care of him. Because of his public profession of faith, he was required to recant and submit himself to Caesar. They required him to go to the temple, to take incense, throw it on the fire, and announce Caesar Kurios. And of course he refused to do so, and he cried out, Christos Kurios. He refused, and he said this, "I am a Christian, and I worship the true God. These sacrifices of yours are made to demons who cannot answer your prayers." For that, he was taken outside the city walls, and he was burned to death. That was the first martyr in England in 314 AD. Petilian, the bishop of the Donatists in Africa in 347 AD, said this, "Think you to serve God by killing us with your hand? Ye err if ye poor mortals think this. God has not hangmen for priests. Christ teaches us to bear wrong, not to avenge it."